Peled is the son of Peled, a famous Israeli general. In 1997, a tragedy struck the family of Israeli-American Miko Peled. His beloved niece, Smalar, was killed by a suicide bomber in Jerusalem, and that tragedy propelled Mr. Peled onto a journey of discovery. It pushed him to re-examine many of the beliefs he had grown up with as a son and grandson of leading figures in Israel's political military elite, and transformed him into a courageous and visionary activist in the struggle for human rights and a hopeful, lasting peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Miko has lived and worked in San Diego, California, since 1986. Thank you, and without further ado, please welcome Mr. Miko Peled.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the Muslim Students Union for hosting me, for hosting this event. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for that lovely opening from the Quran. Having been born and raised in Jerusalem, the sound of the muezzin and the sound of the Muslim prayer is something that I remember and with great fondness. So it makes me feel at home. Thank you. There is this myth out there that there is a conflict between Jews and Muslims. That there's this big conflict going on forever. The truth is that Jewish communities in all over the Middle East have thrived for generations. And there's a story that I like to tell that a friend told me, whose family his family were Arab Jews. They immigrated from Iraq. And when his grandparents immigrated to Israel, what became Israel after the state was established, his grandfather walked around Jerusalem and amazed. He couldn't believe that Jewish people were smoking on the Sabbath and driving on the Sabbath because, according Orthodox Jews don't do this. And his comment was, back where they came from, in the old country, their Muslim neighbors wouldn't smoke on the Sabbath out of respect for the Jews. Yet how could it be that Jewish people are smoking on the Sabbath? So there was a very close relationship and a good relationship between Jews and Muslims historically, and of course, these are sister religions. So thank you again for that. I'm really glad to be here with the invitation to come and speak here today. This is a different talk that I'm going to give this evening, and we'll have books this evening and everything. But I was particularly happy because I wanted to express my great respect to the Irvine 11, who I don't think are here, but that really made their mark on this campus. It's interesting that, here in this campus, 11 courageous students dared to speak truth to power. They dared to stand up and protest and to demonstrate. To say that they're not willing to allow the spokesman of a racist, terrorist state to speak out without voicing their displeasure. They dared to speak out against the man who shamelessly defended or tried to defend violent attacks against innocent civilians. They dared to protest during a speech given here by the Israeli ambassador. In Palestine, as I'm sure you know, other parts of the world where there are progressive activists, they have become heroes. The Irvine 11 have become legends. They did something few have the courage to do. And one would expect that here at the university, which they chose to study, they would be carried on a pedestal. The institution would take pride in that such courage is found among its students. But is that actually what happened? They were punished, taken to court, and the Muslim Students Union was punished as well and shut down. And that's ironic, I think. I think if this took place in another country, say somewhere in the Middle East or in Iran, then there would be an outcry. How dare they limit the right to free speech, and how is it that students were punished for speaking out and protesting? Another bit of irony, I think, is that years from now, when Palestine is free and democratic and the atmosphere changes, the Irvine 11 will be remembered here on this campus as heroes, and no one, not a single person, will admit that they had anything to do with punching. I think the people that had something to do with that will be ashamed of themselves. But I think it's important that we don't forget, and I think it's important that we don't allow them to forget. And I think that the shame that they ought to feel for the actions taken against the 11 will never go away. So there's this myth of democracy, and then there's the reality that people actually face on a day-to-day basis. And speaking of the myth of democracy, there's the myth that says that Israel is a democracy. It's still being perpetuated here in the US and in the West, even in light of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Jewish Israelis here, both here and in Israel, and the Israeli lobby, like to pretend that Israeli Jews are the only rightful citizens in the land. And they will argue that they live in a democracy. This, unfortunately, is far from being true. Israel has occupied Palestine for over 6 decades and has built and invested heavily in all parts of the country. They built cities and towns, industry, shopping malls, schools, highways, have all been built on Palestinian land. Yet Palestinians, who make up today close to half the population, are excluded from most of it. For example, talk about the West Bank. 100% billions upon billions of dollars have been invested in the West Bank since Israel occupied it in 1967. But all of that investment and all of the building that was done in the West Bank was done to bring Israeli Jews to live there and exclude the close to 3 million Palestinians whose land this belongs to in the first place. So 3 million Palestinians are left out, disenfranchised, even as they see their lands taken away, their homes destroyed, and roads, malls, schools, and gated communities are being built for Israeli Jews only, with no access to them or their families. So this is some democracy. The Palestinians of 48, which are the Palestinians who remained after 1948 and became Israeli citizens, what Israel likes to call the Arabs of Israel. You know, it's interesting. I think somebody asked not to record, right? It's recording anyway. To come to an event and blatantly not follow the rules is an interesting form of rudeness.
That's my legal right.
It's an interesting form of rudeness.
We have a right here. I'm not disrupting.
No, you're just being rude. That's your problem, not mine. I do hope that when you go home today, you listen to my remarks over and over again. Hopefully you learned something from this. I'm assuming that you're taking this, that you're videotaping this so that you will listen to it again. But going back to my remarks, the Arabs of 48, the Palestinians of 48, which Israel likes to call the Arabs of Israel, live as second-class citizens with few rights and many racist laws that limit and debilitate their lives. Neglect and discrimination is their lot within a state that claims to be Jewish, yet is built on Arab land. Another interesting point about the Palestinian citizens of the state of Israel, Israel likes to point them out, and pro-Israeli groups like to point them out as an example that Israel is a democracy. Because look, we have Arab citizens. The reality, of course, is they live in such neglect and such atmosphere of discrimination that often the situation in communities, Palestinian communities within Israel, is worse than it is in Gaza. You'll be hard-pressed to find a single dollar invested or a single permit ever given for any Palestinians within Israel to build anything. Yet, of course, building for Israeli Jews goes on all the time. Another example, of course, of this horrendous regime is Gaza. Gaza has been on the receiving end of Israeli terrorism for over 60 years. Israeli terrorist squads have been terrorizing the people in Gaza since the Gaza Strip was created, a few years after the State of Israel was created. And probably the most recent, one of the more recent attacks on Gaza, the assault that began in December of 2008, the assault that I believe Ambassador Oren came here to justify. This was particularly horrendous. Israeli jets, Israeli Air Force jets, dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on a civilian population in Gaza. Now, people in Gaza have never had a tank. They've never had a warplane. They've never had an artillery battery. Yet, and they, of course, Palestinians have never had an army at all. Yet, they're targeted by Israel because they're Palestinians and because they dare to resist. So for 3 weeks that the assault brought about such death and destruction that one can hardly comprehend. Israeli Air Force pilots flew sortie after sortie, dumping hundreds of tons of bombs on Gaza, exposing a civilian population to unimaginable horror, and then returning home to their families to enjoy the holiday of Hanukkah. You see, the attacks of that particular attack took place during the festival of Hanukkah. So these pilots, during the day, would drop bombs and kill civilians. In the evenings, they'd go home to their families and enjoy the celebrations, sleep in their beds, and get up the next morning and do it again and again and again. These are Zionist values. Now, one of the interesting things, one of the comments that's being made often by the pro-Israeli groups, and I've seen this, is they say, well, before the attack, Israel actually passed out leaflets. They dropped leaflets in Gaza warning the people of Gaza that these attacks were impending. How thoughtful of them. Can you imagine the mother who saw the warnings? Or the father who picked up the leaflet, knowing that the death and destruction were pending, but knowing also that there's nowhere to go. Nowhere to take their children, nowhere to hide, nowhere to protect the children from the fire, the smoke, the chemicals, the phosphorus that melts the flesh and won't be extinguished. And there's nowhere to go because Israel imposed a siege on Gaza, a never-ending lockdown on the people of Gaza. So for the Israeli Air Force pilots, young men who Israelis and Zionists around the world admire, this was nothing more than shooting fish in a barrel. They began the attack, this merciless onslaught, precisely at between 11 and 11:30 in the morning of December 27, 2008, a date that I believe will be forever etched in our memory as one of the darkest and most shameful days in the history of the Jewish people. It was the day the so-called Jewish state committed horrendous, shameful crimes by dropping hundreds of tons of these bombs at precisely the time the children in Gaza were in the streets. Because between 11 and 11:30, the two shifts of the school, that has two shifts throughout the day, are on the streets, either coming home or going to school. That was the time the decision makers chose to begin the assault. But besides that, children in Gaza live in despair and hunger with no access to proper health care, even though they live less than an hour's drive from major cities, modern cities where there's no hunger, there's plenty of water, there are good medical facilities and hospitals. They have no access to this because they're Palestinians. There's no justification to the poverty and hunger in Gaza. Gaza literacy rates are some of the highest in the world, over 90%, yet Israel is imposing a siege that is starving and killing people just because Israel doesn't like them. Now, does anybody sincerely expect that close to 6 million Palestinians will continue to live under a regime that is democratic only if you're not a Palestinian? It's democratic only if you're an Israeli Jew? One has to imagine what it was like for whites in South Africa when they began to see that apartheid was falling apart, just how badly they wanted to hold on to their dying way of life, the corrupt way of life that they had. One can only imagine what it was like for white racists here in the southern states in the United States as legalized racism and discrimination came to an end here in this country. We see brutal regimes, and we've seen brutal regimes throughout history fall, but as they fall, they still try to hold on. But in the end, are not successful. Now, Zionists, supporters of Israel, do the same. They hold on to this notion that a racist regime can last, that injustice and horror can last, that crimes against others who are different can go unpunished. But I think that we are near the end. The The irony is that the Zionist dream of an ethnically, religiously homogenous state was actually shattered by the Zionists themselves with their insatiable hunger for land. In their own hands, by their own hands, they created a binational state, a state where half the population is not Jewish or Israeli, but Palestinian Arab. Now, it's true that they have no rights, it's true that they are not counted, but I believe that this will change sooner than most people think. I believe the change is coming to Palestine, whether Israel and its allies like it or not. It's coming thanks to brave students like the members of MSU here, like members of SJP around the country, pro-Palestinian groups all over the US, Canada, Europe, Australia. Change is coming thanks to organizations like the BDS that call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions to be imposed on Israel. I was recently in Ireland in Dublin, where the teachers' union voted to support the academic boycott, which is probably the most difficult, the most controversial aspect of the BDS, which I believe is a brave and bold move to take. Great performers, great artists like Roger Waters and Stevie Wonder and others realize that Israel, like South Africa, is no place for self-respecting performers. And then we must not forget the people on the ground, the non-violent resistance, the popular resistance that takes place in towns and villages all over Palestine. Anybody here see 5 Broken Cameras? Okay, not enough. You'd all see it. It's an excellent movie. It talks about that. It talks about particularly the popular resistance in the village where it began, in Belin. But the villages include Bet Umar, Belin, Abi Saleh, Silwan, Neilin, Sheikh Jarrah, Masra, Silwan, and others, where Palestinians who are committed to justice and democracy organize nonviolent marches every single week. And what, one might ask, is the Israeli response? How does Israel respond to this courageous, peaceful stance taken by these Palestinians? The leaders of these towns, the leaders of these villages are arrested, they get beaten, they're held at facilities like the Offa prison camp, often quite indefinitely. They could be arrested for a day, for a week, for a month, for a year, depending on the mood of the commanding officer. Their children get arrested. They get beaten and tortured. Their homes are invaded by IDF terror squads who destroy the homes from inside. Then, when these brave men and women return home from their incarceration, they're greeted as heroes, which they are, and what do? They lead the marches once again. All of these things that I just mentioned, the student groups on campuses, the BDS, the popular resistance, this is a form of highly principled, nonviolent resistance that is never going to give up. This is a form of resistance to which no brutal regime has an answer. In fact, it was quite ironic. About a year ago, the heads of the Israeli military got together for a weekend or so, for a few days, to answer the question, how do they answer? What is the answer that they have to the nonviolent popular resistance? And all these military giants came out after several days with the reply, they have no answer. And this will go on, of course, until Palestine is free. The problem is, for Israel, that Palestinians constantly and stubbornly interfere with the Zionist myth-making. And so therefore the Palestinians, whether they're men, women, or children, elderly, along with their schools and their mosques, their churches and their ancient cemeteries, and all evidence of their existence must be destroyed so that Zionist claims to exclusive rights to the land may be substantiated. Because those who wish to associate themselves with Zionism and its various tentacles, and the racist state of Israel, and those who wish to drape themselves in the Zionist flag, this flag that has come to symbolize intolerance, hate, racism, and brutality, of course, feel free to do so. But I think you should know, or they should know this, when the trials begin, when the tribunals take their seat, as they will, when the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions begin their work, And then when they are finally shamed to admitting that they were wrong, I think we must all demand of them that they go down on their knees and beg for forgiveness. They need to beg for forgiveness from the people that they so blatantly wronged. And like I said earlier, the people that, if you look today at people who supported apartheid in South Africa, they won't admit it. You're not going to find a single person in the United States or the West that supported apartheid in South Africa. You're not going to find any Nazis in Germany either. Those people disappeared. They have some kind of amnesia. And so I would argue that today the people who support the state of Israel will suddenly forget. But I think it's important that we don't forget. And I think it's important that they know that we won't forget them. And I think it's even more important that they know that their conscience will not let them forget how they draped themselves in that flag, supported the killing, and mocked the bereaved. I think the Palestinian resistance is unshakable, it's immovable, it will never stop. The Palestinian desire for peace will not be crushed, will not be silenced, and it won't end until, like I said, a democratic secular state is established in our shared homeland. A state where Muslims, Christians, and Jews can live as equals. A shared state, a secular democracy where every vote counts, and people can raise their children to love their diverse homeland with its multitude of cultures, its rich history, and its promising future. There's a misguided assumption that because, or when people share a land, it makes them enemies, or inevitably they have to be enemies. It's not true. Israelis and Palestinians will join together in their shared homeland, and they will form something that is greater than the sum of its parts. It'll be a secular democracy with equality, with democracy, for Israelis and Palestinians as equals. Thank you very much.
So the way we're gonna do this is for the question and answer portion. If you could please come to my right or your left and deliver your question, and please take a seat. So please keep your questions concise, relevant to the speaker's topic, and respectful to the speaker. And as per the speaker's request, we will take 3 questions, and then the speaker will answer them in succession. Okay? So if anyone has a question, please go ahead and line up to the right.
Just go ahead and line up over there. If you have a question. Thank you. Okay, go ahead.
Miko, could you talk about the way you were raised in Israel, how you were raised to feel about the Palestinians? The reason I'm asking also is there's a wonderful YouTube of high school students being shown by broken families, Israeli students, and their response is really quite heartbreaking, actually, and wonderful at the same time. Hopeful.
I have a number of issues with what you said. I was in Israel in 2008 when the Operation Cast led, and just returned from there 3 days ago. So I'm not familiar with the situation. First of all, regarding your comments about the Muslim 11, or the UCI 11, whatever you call them, there is a problem in that you misunderstand what free speech is. Free speech is you can say whatever you want.
I misunderstand?
Yeah. and
You're here to tell me that I
Muslims,
misunderstand?
and let me explain what our culture is.
Are you going to
Our
give me a lecture, or
culture
are you going to ask a
is that
question?
you speak and then I speak. You give me a chance to talk.
Are you giving a lecture?
And I listen, and then you have a chance to talk, and then I listen.
No, that's not how it
That's
works.
our culture.
That's not how it works.
It's not shouting down somebody and have the
It's
rule
not how it
of
works.
law.
I came to give a lecture. You may ask a question, not give a counter lecture. You want to give you have an answer? You have a question, Amy?
You also. To mention
So you're going to give a lecture. All right, so sit
the
down.
half of the rockets that went into Israel from Gaza
If you
that
could please
preceded that.
answer the question. Thank you.
You also neglected to mention the Arabs, Israeli Arabs that serve as members of Knesset. You also neglected to mention the treatment of Jews in the Arab countries. You know, it's a
If you have a
completely
question for the
biased.
speaker, please give it. and
Yes,
sit
my
down. Thank you.
speech, my answer, my question is this. Why is this monomaniacal obsession with Israel? There are 70,000 Syrians that were just murdered a few feet away in the last 21 months. Why do we have an Israel Awareness Week every week, year after year, when there are many more times Muslims killed in Syria and Mali and all over the world? Only this obsession with Israel. That's the question.
Yeah, sure. We have. That really wasn't a question. So there's actually two more before I can reply. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I just wanted to mention something that you started off your address by saying that you were excited by the invitation from the DCI and MSU to come speak here. I want to know if you're aware that from the same podium, the same platform that you're talking, the MSU has repeatedly brought down a speaker by the name of Malik Ali, who has called Jews not Zionists. Okay, I'm a Jew. I'm an observant Hasidic Jew. And he said that the Jews are the new Nazis. This is a quote that he said. You can ask the fellows over here. And afterwards, they continue to bring him down to speak. So when you say, you know, if you're reluctant maybe to come speak, but you feel like you have a message, I want to know how you're excited by an invitation from a group that repeatedly brought down a speaker, that's just one of his quotes, but has preached blatant anti-Semitism, and nothing to do with Israel. And he didn't say Zionists are the new Nazis. He said Jews are the new Nazis. So if you wanted to share with me how you're excited and you're proud of speaking from the same podium as a speaker like that.
I don't know what that question's all about. Are there any questions other than this?
Yeah, one
Please.
more.
Yeah.
The Arab League offered Israel recognition and peace a few years ago. Israel refused. Why?
Okay. Thank you. Okay. You know, so hold on. I'll answer these three, and then we'll do another round. And you go over there. There's this particular topic, of course, is highly charged. There's no question about that. I don't think I'm bringing any news here. And typically in events like this, a speaker is invited to speak, and people can choose to come and listen. If they choose to come and listen, that's fine. But the rules of engagement are not that after the speech is over, everybody else gets to give a counter speech. If you don't like what you heard, you just take it in and you go home. If you have a question to ask, you ask a question and you go home. I've been to speeches, I've been to events where the speaker spoke, said things that I did not agree with. It didn't occur to me to stand and demand equal time to give an extra speech. That's not how it works. So it's interesting that when pro-Israeli groups send their delegates to events like this, they always feel they have the right to give a counter speech. That's not how it works. I have the podium, and I was invited to speak, and nobody else was. You may listen quietly, or you may be rude and not follow the rules as you choose to do, but that's your problem. but you don't get to do what you like. The first question was how I was raised in regards to Palestinians. I'm going to get more into that in tonight's lecture when I actually talk about the book, because my book talks about how I was raised and the Zionist upbringing and so on. But it was interesting. I'll tell you one little story that I will probably talk about tonight as well. That's a big part of my book as well. It's a story that has to do with my mother. And she told me the story about 1948. She was a young mother then. She's 86 years old now. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. And she talked about how when the Palestinian neighborhoods in West Jerusalem were taken, their homes were made available for Israeli families, to Israeli families. We're not talking about the old city of Jerusalem, we're talking about neighborhoods outside the city. These are beautiful homes, these are beautiful neighborhoods, well-to-do people and so forth. Now the community was forced to leave and these homes were made available to Israeli families. Now the narrative that you learn as an Israeli, and the Zionist narrative in general, which is also prevalent here, is that the Arabs attacked in 1948, intending to destroy the Jewish community. Miraculously, the Jews prevailed, and the Jewish state was established. And then the Jewish state, the state of Israel, asked the Palestinians to stay, and they left anyway. Well, this is true, then there's no problem taking a home, because the people left on their own accord. If they left an empty house, and there's somebody who needs a house, why not take it? There's no moral dilemma here. The story my mother told, the way she told that story of how she was offered that home, she was shocked that anybody would expect she would take somebody else's home. And the way she tells the story, even today, when she's 86, she's been telling me the story her whole life, my whole life, is how could I possibly take the home of another family? How could I possibly move into the home of another mother that now has to live in exile? Now that was a problem for me, because you grow up, on the other hand, in a country that teaches a certain narrative. And the narrative of 1948, the heroism and so forth that the Israelis claim was theirs, is part of our identity as Israelis. And the story that my mother told kind of put a kink in this narrative. It was a problem for me. And it wasn't until many, many years later, actually, that I began to understand and reconcile what the problem was and what she was telling me. And in fact, what she was saying is she was saying exactly what Palestinians have been saying since 1948, that they were forced out of their homes, their country was taken, and their homes were taken. So I guess I was raised with this dual message. On the one hand, this message from home, on the other hand, this message from school and the community and so forth. The way my life ended up, I was fortunately exposed to Palestinians more than most Israelis are. I was exposed to Palestine more than most Israelis are. My father's activism after he retired from the military had a lot to do with it. And I was able to really engage this issue in a way that led me to where I am today, realizing that while Jews as a religion really have no claim to Palestine or to that country, Israelis who were born and raised there, even though they are the children of colonizers and settlers, this is their home. So they have a right to be there. Palestinians, of course, have a right to be there, and the two nations need to create a democracy with equal rights for everyone, because they both have are both justified in living there and claiming the land to be theirs, to be their home. So that was my upbringing. That was how I ended up with this point of view. I think there's an obsession with Israel, and I don't know if it is an obsession, but I think there's an interest. When you look at the map, and I do this often when I speak in schools, I'll show a map, or I'll ask the students if there's anybody who cannot find it on the map. And often there are people who cannot find it on a map. And when you look at a map, it's not surprising. I mean, you can't blame somebody for not finding it on the map. Because what do you see when you look at a map of the region? You see Africa, it's huge. You see the Arabian Peninsula, it's huge. You see other parts of Turkey and Syria, and you see all these big countries. And then there's a sliver of land right on the coast. The name of this country doesn't fit, so it's usually on the Mediterranean. Sometimes they'll just say Jerusalem, or they'll abbreviate it. And that's the country we're all talking about. So perhaps there is an obsession. So perhaps there is an obsession, but I don't think the obsession is necessarily on one side or the other. I think the obsession, if there is one, is perhaps on both sides. How and why is it that everybody chooses to talk about that sliver of land where so much takes place in Africa, and so much takes place in other countries. And I think the reality is that people do talk about other things too. People do talk about Syria, and people do talk about Darfur, and people do talk about other places, and people do talk about this. There's room and there's time for talk about all these atrocities and all these regimes that have to be changed. I think the other reason that there's so much interest in Israel is because people feel cheated. I think many people, like I did, were brought up on this notion that Israel is this very positive, good thing. That it's a democracy, that it was an opportunity for Jewish people to once again find a homeland, and so on. And what they find is that it's not true. They found that the state of Israel was established as a result of a horrendous act of terrorism that was inflicted by Zionist militias against the Palestinians, a terrible campaign of ethnic cleansing. Today you have millions of refugees who live in refugee camps who are not permitted to go back to their homes. Yet people talk of the right of all Jews to go to that place and live there and claim it as theirs. There's this horrific double standard that people just don't want to stand for. So I think perhaps the sense of disappointment from what Israel could have been, maybe should have been, or maybe never could have been and should have been, but there was this expectation, and now we realize it was a big lie, and there's a lot of potential. I mean, Israeli and Palestinian societies have a lot of potential. They're both very highly educated societies, they're highly industrious, they're hardworking. They could create something wonderful together, as long as it's not one at the expense of the other. So again, I don't know if it is an obsession, but there's certainly a lot of interest, and I think those are the reasons why. It's interesting you asked about the Arab peace plan. There was an old Arab peace plan, I think in 2002, and now there's this new discussion with the Secretary of State, with Kerry, who spoke at the Foreign Relations Committee and said that there's still a small window of opportunity for a two-state solution, for peace, within a year or two. Israel did not accept any peace plan, will never accept any peace plan. Israel and Zionism are in their essence, contradict any notion of compromise on the land. Zionism says this land belongs to the Jewish people, we are here to give it to the Jewish people. Anybody else who lives there is there by mistake and needs to go. And if anything, we've seen anything over the last 65 years, is how Israel does it. Through ethnic cleansing, through killing, through racist laws, and so on. So I don't think there's any surprise that Israel refuses to make peace, particularly on the issue of Palestine, because it means they would have to compromise on the land. Israel is the obstacle to peace in Palestine, because for Israel, this is a zero-sum game. It's everything. And if this conflict goes on for another 100, 200 years, there's no problem, as long as they've got the bigger army. And if we look at the history of this, what they call this ridiculous peace process, in the early 70s, there were Israelis like my father and Neri and other Zionist Israelis who wanted to develop this notion of the two-state solution. Maybe there was some kind of a compromise where you could have two states. Well, they went on and discussed it, and that's where that plan was put together. In the 80s, the Israeli Knesset passed a law that made it illegal for these people to meet and talk to Palestinians, to the PLO. And then suddenly in the 90s, they signed the Oslo Peace Accord. And you have to wonder, wow, people thought we're being changed, Israel changed, Israel really wants peace. But the people who actually did read the Oslo Peace Accord realized and said very clearly, there is nothing peaceful about the Oslo Peace Accord. It's an attempt to bring the Palestinians to surrender. By 1993, it was absolutely clear the West Bank could never become a Palestinian state. It was completely integrated into Israel. The conquest of the West Bank became completely irreversible, and that's why Rabin and Paris and those others decided it was a good time to bring in Arafat to pretend to make peace, but try to bring him to surrender, which they couldn't, which is why it failed. But again, this is why Israel is against it. Israel will never accept any kind of a peaceful resolution with the Palestinians. It will never recognize that Palestinians have any right. That's why peace lies beyond Zionism. Peace that's where the equivalence with South Africa is. You have to get rid of apartheid in order to have a democracy and move on. You're going to have to get rid of this Zionist entity in a peaceful way, through political transformation that will bring about a real democracy with equal rights for everybody, for all the citizens. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you for coming out. We hope today's event was informative. Our series continues the rest of the week. We will be out on Ring Road during the day, so please join us for tonight for the General Son Part 2 with Mr. Miko, sharing his experiences growing up as a son of an IDF soldier. And this will be at 7:30 p.m. in the Crystal Cove Auditorium. And and you'll be selling his books. And also, we have shirts in the back for $5 for this week. And just for people in MSU, we're just gonna have to just like hold on in the back. Just stay here like after the event, because we're gonna have a quick little meeting for the rest of the week. And I would like to thank everyone else for coming out, and we hope to see you tonight.